Welcome to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
and Ryan Buller.
And today we're going to tackle a little bit of a difficult topic that is finding resolution with some previous proclamations of the church about no salvation outside the church, and maybe more recent proclamations out of the Second Vatican Council that actually clarify that there is salvation outside the church. And so we're going to dive into that and try to help everyone to resolve and find resolution in these statements, especially since we've had some quotes recently from Pope Francis that have caused some concern for people who aren't aware of this.
Yeah, so this came, sort of through the request line. Some friends of ours, their daughter is a college student, and she asked us to speak on this because there is some confusion there. And then I've, since she suggested it, I've heard some other people struggling with reconciling these two teachings. And so this comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, sections 839 through 848. They deal with these two teachings, one affirming the church fathers teaching no salvation outside of the church, but then also clarifying, what does that mean practically for people who, maybe lived before Christ, established a church, or, have never heard the gospel message, live in different parts of the world where the population is not Christian. So what does that mean to them? How do we reconcile these two things? And so in contemplating this, the first thing that became apparent to me is, okay, let's start with no salvation outside of the church. And the church is our home. That's what came to me. So the church teaches, these three parts of the church militant, which is us here on earth, the church suffering, those in purgatory, and the church in heaven, the church triumphant. So those are all different parts of our home. Of course, two of those are temporary, and only one is eternal. But it's all one church. So if you're gonna technically ever be in heaven, then you're gonna be in the church. You're gonna be in part of the church triumphant. So that's what it means to say no salvation outside the church. You have to eventually get into the church. Otherwise, outside of the church, after the end of the age of the earth, there's the only distinction is going to be heaven and hell. And so outside of the church is going to literally mean that you're in hell at some point in time. Now, that entering of the church may not be in this life. It may be, you have to go through purgatory after death, and then enter into the church finally in heaven. And so that's what the church was distinguishing in the teachings of Vatican II. And there's, a lot of distinctions in there, as far as pagans versus Protestants versus, there's even a special couple of lines on Muslims in particular in the Catechism. So there's these different distinctions there. And then the major point the church wants to make too is that there's a difference between never hearing the gospel message and rejecting the gospel message. And as our listeners are either aware or can guess, that it's much more damning to reject the gospel message in favor of a pagan religion or pagan worship versus versus never hearing it and having this sort of, I forgot the exact wording, but this, defense of ignorance, basically.
So less culpability because you
Absolutely.
aren't aware, right?
So Ryan, you were talking about the Catechism of the Catholic Church and citing Lumen Gentium, I think is number 14. The one, I guess, section that kind of stood out to me, and this is number 846, is where it talks about, recalls that Christ asserted the necessity of faith and baptism, and thereby affirmed at the same time the necessity of the church. And we were talking about, of course, the church. Hence, they could not be saved who, knowing that the Catholic Church was founded as necessary by God through Christ, would refuse or to enter it or refuse to remain in it. So, there's those the two options in the very end, either refusing to enter into it or refusing to remain in it. So you have, I guess, you could put it into three different categories as those who have never heard it, and like you were saying, if you're in the middle of Antarctica in a commune there, you never heard the gospel, never heard anything about Christ. That's one thing, but then those who refuse to enter into it, and then those who refuse to remain in it. That's, as you said, a whole lot more serious with regard to culpability. And I think that as we, kind of, I guess, flesh this out and, peel the onion back, there are, deep theological issues and topics, and then obviously the topic of what the Holy Father said. And I think what you said, Ryan, is really very important, is that we always turn to the Catechism of the Catholic Church and let that be our guide. So
yeah, I mean, as far as the Pope's comments, like we were talking about earlier, the context is very important. If we're going to look at just this one instance, he's speaking in Indonesia, where there's a very minority of Christians. And, I mean, let's face it, we would all, in some respect, kind of do the same thing. If we were in a room with some non-Catholic, non-Christian, we wouldn't start the conversation by saying, hey, there's no salvation outside the church.
Exactly.
I mean, if we truly love that person, if we desire for them to ever enter the church, or we desire anything good and happy for them, we would start by finding common ground. I mean, that's our basic instinct tells us that's the right thing to do. And so I think this is helpful to look at the analogy that the church fathers often used of the church as a ship. This is a very common theme throughout our tradition, as the church as a ship. They even designed cathedrals to look like ships. The Noah's Ark was sort of a proto, it's like typology of the church as a ship. Our Blessed Mother is often referred to in this image, and so the church is the ship that guides the faithful through the seas of this life and all the the storm, the choppy waves and the different obstacles to get us through our earthly pilgrimage to the other side, to salvation. And so, I like to think, okay, well, can a small, 20-foot sailboat or a bay boat, can that cross the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean? Well, technically, yes. I mean, it does float. If the wind and the current was in its favor and it didn't meet any major storms, I mean, I guess there's no physical laws dictating the ship can't cross that ocean if a million things work out in its favor. But, there are also certain ocean liners that it's almost a guarantee that they're going to make it across the ocean. And so, that's one way to looking at an analogy to understand these two teachings. Like, yes, these other faiths, they are ships, they do float on top of the water, but they don't have the fullness of truth, so that there's a lot of obstacles that can inhibit it from making the difficult journey to get from, our fallen nature and sin to the other side. And so if you were going to have a conversation with that person, if you started the conversation by saying, hey, your boat doesn't float, well, they're not going to be open to what you have to say after that, because they're going to think like, you don't understand the basic laws of physics, and my boat, I've seen it float. I know that it can float at least for a short distance. So you want to start with recognizing that there is some truth to this faith and there is some common ground. The boat does actually float and then work your way to why your boat has this big diesel engine and can withstand the obstacles.
And we all want to be on the ocean liner, right?
Yes.
And the thing is, we all want everyone to be on the ocean liner. So I think in terms of the context, what the Holy Father said, some people said, well, he said this on Friday the 13th. So, oh my gosh, that has to be an omen and whatnot. Well, rest assured that we are not superstitious, and nor should anyone in the church be. But you're right. He was speaking to a group of college, junior college students in Singapore, and he set aside his prepared remarks. And as you said, he was in a room of mostly non-Christians. And so it was an opportunity to evangelize. Now, some would say that, he waded into the area of relativism and whatnot. But as you said, if we were in the same situation, how would we reach out to those individuals to show that, our faith is the true faith, but at the same time, slowly, I guess, reeling them in and educating them, which you're not going to do you might have 25 minutes, you might have 30 minutes. So you want to find that middle ground or approximate middle ground as quickly as possible. Now, did the Holy Father, do that? I guess that's, to each individual's interpretation on whether, what he said specifically was middle ground or not. But, keeping in mind that, as leader of the church, his role is not only to lead our church, but also, reach out in an evangelical fashion as well.
And Jeff, you had mentioned earlier that the more dramatic thing of someone being in Antarctica and not hearing the message, but there's also just some situations like I think the folks that he addressed there that are maybe don't have the right perspective on what it is, and not that they're out in nowhere not hearing anything, but they're not hearing sometimes the right thing. So and the reason I'm saying that is I read a long time ago a book called Struck by Lightning, which was about a woman who was struck by lightning and had a near-death experience and experienced purgatory, for which she came back and has been proclaiming her message and making a lot of converts herself, which I pray many of those people that the Pope spoke to will have a seed planted as well. But she said that that there were some people, a lot of people asked different questions about what she saw in purgatory, and especially about some people, like Protestant people. Did she see Protestant people that made it or whatever? And she said that one of her experiences was that a Protestant person was being offered Eucharist as a test to see if they could go to heaven. So, and that was because you have to eat of my flesh and drink of my blood to have true life within you. And I thought that was an amazing example. That was just one of her stories, but I think that gives a good, I guess, image or picture, even if you don't have to believe private revelation, of what this might look like, even if that person didn't die a Catholic.
And where would that Eucharist have come from? It would have had to have come from a Catholic priest here on earth saying Mass, because I think that's another interesting point in this conversation of in the no salvation outside of the church camp. Like, so if the church militant, the church here on earth, if it ceased to exist, then no salvation would be possible anymore. Like if all the Catholics died out, there was no more masses being said. Christ promised that's not going to happen. But theoretically, if that did happen, then yes, the gates would be shut, because the church, the three parts are connected, and if one of the parts is severed, then the gates are closed, the gates are locked. So ultimately, everyone in a temporal sense is dependent on the church here on earth for them to reach salvation. That if the church discontinues here, then even the pagans or Protestants cannot reach heaven anymore.
You are listening to Catholic Radio for Acadiana, Christ our King Catholic Radio, 90.5 FM, 99.5 FM, and 1230 AM. We are your lay Dominicans, Third Order Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and this show is called Studium to Studio, and we bring our contemplation from our readings and our studium to the studio, and we do this every Thursday at 4 p.m., and want to thank our sponsor, Stein Lumber, with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And so today, we are talking about salvation. Is it only within the church? Can salvation be had outside the church? And this is something that theologians have spent probably many, many centuries talking about, and either reaffirming or tamping down different heresies that have been out there. And we're talking about this today. Pope Francis mentioned about different religions in his speech in Singapore back on September 13th. And so we're just going through, what do we make of it? And I think, moving forward, we look at how do we evangelize individuals? When we have the opportunity to evangelize, what do we say? We as Dominicans, obviously preachers, but also we need to share the message of the truth, which is the church. And I guess we look at, how do we go about doing that? Ryan, is there any thoughts that you have, or in looking at what Pope Francis said, how would we do something or say something different?
Yeah, so I think that especially our time, people are very wary of inauthenticity. It has to be authentic, and people can smell that from a mile away because there's so much, especially with our virtual world, there's so much just that's not real, and people are increasingly becoming more and more hungry for something that is real. And so we have to make that invitation to our brothers who are away from the sacrament or have never heard of the church. We have to make that very obvious in our witness that it's real for us, and we're living it, and we're experiencing the graces that come with it. And so I think the natural order is for us to first have an interior conversion, and then exteriorly we want to make that manifest around us by changing our habits, which we talk about the virtues a lot, and changing our environment around us. I mean, I think like a good Catholic home environment is and holy Catholic friendships is incredibly evangelical in our time, and it's amazing when you dedicate that time for prayer and study, like in the commitments that, especially as we take as third orders, but at which everyone in the church is called to take on. You have that interior conversion. Your heart is moved, and the presence of God comes closer and closer in you and becomes more and more real. Your faith, you really grow in those theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, and then that manifests in different changes around your habits and your disposition and your environment. And then the natural thing is to want to share that with others. After it's changed your heart, it's changed your environment, you're going to want to go out and share it, and it will be authentic at this point.
Cheryl, what about you in terms of evangelizing? You run into people every week and have the opportunity to share different perspectives, and even people know that we have a radio program, and so that's an opportunity. What are some of the things that you might recommend for us to do as Third Order Dominicans, or even our listeners to do as we run into either non-Catholics or Catholics that have left the faith? Any words of wisdom on that?
I think I can't outdo what Ryan just said. I mean, the sincerity of our own prayer life and living our life is what is really important in this. And Ryan had talked before we came in here a little bit about how he had a problem maybe with some of this not being reconciled when, about 10 years ago or something. And I thought that was a good example of like how you worked through that. But then when we came to the fact that you asked the question of actually a Dominican friar, then why do we evangelize if, there's others outside the church that can be saved? And there wasn't necessarily an answer, but you grew into that answer and maturing in your spiritual life, right? Is that how you?
Yes. I really, to me, the crux was like, wow, how am I supposed to get up every day and like go out and preach that? When the church is saying like, oh, they can, be fine, if they never hear it, they have this sort of veil that's protecting them of ignorance. But as I grew in my interior life, especially, like what we read about in our studium, The Three Ages of the Interior Life, and growing in prayer and contemplation and really seeing like everything that gives life meaning is found through the Catholic Church. And so as I sort of died interiorly to these other sources of happiness, even good things, and then, because I was living more and more for the greatest thing, which is our relationship in and with the Holy Trinity, and just fell more and more in love with God. Then it became very obvious that like, motivation to evangelize is never lacking anymore. Even if they can be saved on a technicality, they would have to, live their life without getting all this richness and these great experiences. And so I think that another part of the conversation is it's a special dignity that we deserve as human beings of having a rational soul to be given this choice. We do this all the time in life with, especially in our culture, we put a high priority on choice. But if these people are never taught the gospel message and never seen the fullness of truth, they're never given the dignity of being able to have that choice being made. So it's an interesting conversation of like, they deserve to have this choice. But then we also believe in, baptizing infants and catechizing children, before they're, of age to make that choice. So that's another sort of, how do we reconcile those two things? What do y'all think?
Well, before I go into that, because I feel like that might be a whole nother show.
Okay, fair enough.
But I do think that when you were talking about, that purpose of evangelizing, and when you said that, I brought up the Bible verse, John 10:10. I came that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. And this is what we really want for every individual. And I think that I was telling them that a long time ago, we were in a marriage program, and they were discussing marriage in this way, but I would say that life could be like this too. You can kind of carry it around like a watermelon, like a burden, and like just get by with doing that. Or you can learn how to open up the watermelon and eat the fruits, and it's a wonderful, it's what God wants us to do, is to really enjoy and have peace in this life by loving others, and like you said, growing in virtue. And if we can do that, and we enjoy that and show that joy, and truly it is a joy and a blessing. I know that I can't imagine. We all go through trials in life, and the things we go through, being where I am at a state of peace and joy and hope, if I did not have the church, which I'm a convert, so that I definitely am grateful for that. But as far as I will kind of dabble in the baptism and everything, because we want that, for our kids. So our hope is by getting that grace and by them growing and understanding that hopefully they'll have more to cultivate later when they make that. They still have to make that choice, and yes. We certainly know that with our 8 children, that some of them as adults, as a matter of fact, 4 are adults, 2 have made a choice to stay in the church and to embrace their faith, and to have not. Well, actually, now we have 5, so 3 have made a choice to do that, but we have 2 right now that are on another journey. But I hope there's so much planted there that they can come back and fall back on that grace when, as we know, they continue to chase things that aren't going to take them to a place of peace and hope and trust, because our hearts are restless until they rest in God. So I guess that's one one way to look at the baptism. And for early and infant, they still have to make that decision at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of issues with that, but I hear it coming up and up again about, people, especially in our culture, they want to, wait before presenting the faith to their children because, they need to be old enough to make a choice. But, I mean, philosophically, I mean, come on. I mean, you're going to, what if your kid doesn't like eating healthy food? You're going to not feed it to them until they're old enough to wait. I mean, like,
exactly.
You give your kids good things and good gifts. I mean, that's the nature of being in love with your children and taking your responsibility to care for them. But yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, in the evangelization question, it's about giving good gifts. It's about being so excited about what you have that you want to give it to other people, and recognizing that, we're all connected as humans, and if one person suffers, we all suffer because we're social people. And if one person is fully alive, we all benefit because we're all connected. We're all in a society together, and metaphysically, we're all connected as well. Our souls are connected. And we all intuit this on a regular basis. We know that, like, we want to lift up our neighbor, and we want to protect them and keep them from suffering, because it all affects us. And speaking of that, another point in this is the danger of being ignorant of the faith. I mean, you look at a lot of these ancient pagan societies that very frequently, if you study, fell into these great errors, such as human sacrifice being the ultimate, but just a lot of suffering took place. I mean, read about Sodom and Gomorrah. The state of human societies before Noah and the flood. I mean, it's just a lot of suffering to be had when you live in that ignorance. So yes, we are protected by that veil of ignorance in a certain sense, that we can still be saved, but the dangers are even more so real and present, and there could be a lot of suffering in this life and even eternally if that gospel message is not preached.
And I think the Holy Spirit uses us in different ways, in ways that we may not even know it. We run across individuals who, may say certain things about the church or have questions, and are we prepared to answer them? And, we have so many opportunities to evangelize, and, you don't have to be a theologian or a philosopher to answer people's basic questions. And that's kind of what we're called to do. I know if we're wearing our Dominican crosses and, we're out in public, and I've gotten many comments on, "Oh, that's a nice cross," or "Hey, what order is that?" And so immediately you are able to pick up a conversation and talk about St. Dominic, talk about the church, and maybe even invite questions from them. So, we have that opportunity. And, if the Holy Spirit is calling you to look into your faith deeper and, in study and in community and preaching the gospel, then, maybe thinking about becoming a Third Order Dominican might be up your alley. If you're interested, go to laydomsouth.org. It's laydomsouth.org. And there's lots of information there on formation and reaching out and connecting with a chapter in your area. And it's something that the Holy Spirit, I think, called us to do in various times in our life. And so just be open to that Holy Spirit and what He's calling you to do.
And remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded.